All right, we are going to go ahead and get started. I really appreciate everybody joining us today, and I'm very excited about sharing with you more information about our newest report called Divided by Design. A little background, this is something I have wanted to put together for some time now. I'm Beth Osborne. I am the Vice President for Transportation and Thriving Communities at Smart Growth America. And before coming to Smart Growth America, I worked at the U.S. Department of Transportation and managed what was then called the Tiger Discretionary Grant Program, and it's now called RAISE. With those funds, we did support some analysis of ways to deal with infrastructure that was dividing communities, particularly Black and Brown communities, including in my hometown of New Orleans, looking at the Claiborne. But one thing that became very clear to me is how many different ways the underlying program, including in the details of the program, there were requirements that created inequities in the outcomes. And I wanted to put something together that explained that. And with the help of just an incredibly talented and wonderful group of coworkers, we've been able to do that. And this is the result. Before I get rolling, again, if you have any questions, feel free to put it in the Q&A. If you're having any problems with sound or seeing the presentation, which should be up on your screen right now, then I invite you to put that in the chat. So let me make sure. Yep. All right. So divided by design. This is a report that's been created by me and colleagues here at Smart Growth America. I want to give a particular shout out to Abby Grimminger, who was the head writer, and Megan Wright, who did a lot of the data, all the data work in this report, and also the great comms team here that helped make it look so pretty, but also give people interaction. No, someone says they're having trouble. I'm going to try to share again. All right. Hopefully that did the trick. Yes. Okay. So going on in the presentation. The report itself is divided into 3 different sections. I want to make clear this was not an attempt to capture all the inequities in the transportation system, because one, others have done a really good job of talking about some of the impacts, and it would take volumes to get into everything. So what we did focus on was the inequities built into the U.S. Surface Transportation Program, dating back to the program's beginning in the 1950s. We also then move into part 2, where we try to show that those inequities are still very much a part of the overall program today. And even if the intentions are not the same as they often were in the earlier days of the program, the outcomes are the same because we have not updated our rules, our models, our standards, and our procedures. And section 3 is outlining concrete steps we need to take to reorient the program in a way that unwinds these inequities. During the 1950s, when seeing the way cities were changing, highways were viewed as a way to connect particularly white suburbanites with urban centers. And the hope was, if there was a direct connection on the interstates from the suburbs to the downtown, we could save downtown retail. But the other purpose that is often cited outwardly is that it could be a tool of so-called urban renewal, where they would remove I heard that someone lost sound. Hopefully that helps. The goal was to remove what they called blighted areas and pave the way for economic revitalization and displacing communities of color. They often called these areas blighted, even though they were not, and used blight as a synonym, quite frankly, for communities that were non-white. We have a bunch of examples that we get into in the report, but we also try to tell the story of what was there before, and tell it with pictures and with video, because there is really an incredible visual impact of wiping out blocks and blocks and blocks of beautiful neighborhood in order to make space for a highway. And we quantified the history using two cities as examples, DC, Washington, DC, which I am in downtown right now, and Atlanta. And what we wanted to look at was the impact of some of the highways that were built, and you'll see that here on this slide in orange. But you will also notice that we get into unbuilt segments, and that's in blue here. And so what we did was try to quantify what was lost where the interstate was built, and to quantify what would have been lost had we moved forward on these other proposed segments of highway. I will say that the segment of I-66 would have gone pretty close to where I live, and this is a really vibrant part of DC, which we are we have some videos that show exactly what would be lost. So the methodology, and I am not going to go into great detail here. We do have the woman who headed this effort up on the call, and she can answer questions if people want to get into deeper conversation about the methodology. But I can give you an overview. One is we had to identify the highway segments and map them. That is easier where the highways were built. That is significantly harder where they were still proposed and not built. And I will also say, just figuring out how wide to make them. You know, we chose very conservative estimates of the amount of land that would have been harmed or disturbed by these highways. In reality, it's a much wider swath of land than just where the highway goes and a little bit of staging on the side of it. But we wanted to look at, you know, a very conservative estimate. And then we pulled census tracts and relevant demographic information between 1960 and 2020. We created a 200-foot buffer around the highway segment that we were analyzing. Again, I think we could very easily argue that that is not wide enough, that if you look at where highways were built, that they have a much wider impact on the area around them. But again, we wanted to be more conservative. We aggregated census and land value assessment data into the impact area for the segments, and then we pulled commercial data from CoStar. And these were the things we quantified. It was the value of land within each segment's impact area, the population living within each segment that was displaced, the impact on businesses within that area, the housing equity impacts, basically how much home equity was lost due to the highway construction, something that we know is one of the major areas of wealth building, particularly across generations, and one that non-white populations have not been able to participate in due to efforts like what we're talking about here. And then the impact on taxable property as well. And looking at that, here is Washington, D.C.'s unbuilt segment. There would have been at least 18,000 residents displaced. We would have seen a bigger impact on Black residents displaced over white residents displaced. We would have seen a loss of $6.8 billion in taxable land value. 6.6 billion in lost property value, 35 million in lost property taxes, and a lot of home equity. I want to point out that, and we'll get into this a little bit more, when we value what is important to the economy about highways, we rarely put a value on what is lost in building these highways. And a lot of it is because in economics within transportation agencies, there's a belief that it just moves the economic value around the region. So yes, you might have lost a land value, but it's taken up someplace else, or the business that's closed goes someplace else. And especially when you're talking about smaller businesses and Black-owned businesses, that is not necessarily the case. It might move around, but it also might be a wealth transfer from one group to another. And usually that's Black to white, or Latina to white, or something like that. So we wanted people to be able to look at these numbers and see these impacts. Actually, let me just, I somehow skipped over the DC built segment. We did see at I-395 and 695, at least 4,700 people were displaced. It was more Black than white. It was 311 acres and 3.3 billion in taxable land, a lot of lost home value, a lot of lost property taxes, commercial buildings, at 1,500 and 1,400 occupied housing units. In Atlanta, interestingly, in Atlanta, there was a bigger imposition on white residents, but in the pictures you can see, particularly when the highway reaches the Black area, it was more land was cleared than would have been needed to in order to truly build that segment. Again, I want to encourage people to put questions in the Q&A. We will not really be looking at the webinar chat for questions, so make sure you put those in the Q&A. And then you can also see here how much money was lost that could be collected for government and property taxes to maintain roadways, highways, sewers, police, fire, education, all those sorts of things, and a huge amount of home equity. In the unbuilt segment, you see very similar results again. These are existing communities today that would not be there were this segment of I-485 built. And in my opinion, the numbers are just staggering. I'm going to now share with you a video that we were able to create with the help of some folks who are expert in these sorts of animations over at Segregated by Design, that can show the actual physical impact of what was proposed. And this is showing if I-66 had been built through Washington, D.C. as originally planned. And as I said, we did include a buffer in that, but as you can see here, it was not a big buffer. And I'm just going to let the animation roll you through all of the buildings and businesses that would not have been in this area in the heart of Washington, D.C. I think you can tell from this why it can be argued that the impact zone would have been much bigger. Clearly, you know, the buildings that are halved by this would have been taken down completely, and there would have been a much bigger impact zone. But looking at how many buildings, particularly historic buildings, would have just been ripped out and this huge barrier put in place is really quite breathtaking. Here we go. Now, this is an example of a highway that was in fact built through Atlanta. This is a before, and that's an after. Now, I think the picture tells the story pretty well of the lost economic value, but we also have this animation here that shows exactly what was wiped out for the highway. I have to say, I find it very interesting in the undeveloped areas. There seems to have been an effort to keep the highway a little bit more narrow and fit it in that area. But then when it comes into some of the residential areas, it really broadens out. And some of it's for interchanges, but maybe larger interchanges than are needed, especially here. The quote from the mayor at the time is quite clarifying that this would be a border between white and black areas. That was part of the intent. And we are finally nearing the end of the highway. So hopefully these videos, and we have one of the built segments for both cities and the unbuilt segments for both cities on our website, where you can find Divided by Design. But the idea is to make clear that there are very real neighborhoods, very real communities that were lost, and how dramatic it was, and how little effort there was at the time, but even today there is, to quantify what we're giving up so that we can do a real analysis of the full costs and benefits. These would be considered disbenefits, and you would remove them from the overall benefit calculation before you brought in the cost, but we don't tend to do that. So how today's transportation program exacerbates these inequities and really continues them gets into the fact that the primary goal of the program is to get cars moving fast. And anything that we can do to get those cars moving fast is worth it. And we have tons of guidance on how to calculate that. And we don't even accept the calculation of some of the things that are lost. This is a great cartoon that Gene Way that we worked with put together to explain that kind of dichotomy. You know, at one time we're quantifying the damage of congestion, but once we fix the congestion, because the congestion can't be good for business, once we fix it by wiping out the business, somehow that's the victory. And at least here at Smart Growth America, we think what is lost is highly damaging. One of the big things that we talk about in not just this document, but in others, is when a roadway is conceived of, whether it's being built, it's being expanded, it's being analyzed. Engineers look at something called level of service, which is basically looking at the speed and density of the vehicles. And when the vehicles are slowed down, even if they're only slowed down for a very short period of the day, when, you know, everyone's commuting or something like that, or just a few times a year because of special events, like maybe a football game, or a Friday when everyone goes out to the beach, that is considered to be the worst outcome. And therefore we are willing to divide communities, wipe out communities, make it unsafe to move around outside of a vehicle or even inside of a vehicle to get across the corridor. As long as on this corridor that we're analyzing, we can get those cars flowing again. We don't understand, frankly, how to model the impact of making more space available for vehicles. One of the concepts that we fail to comprehend is the concept of induced demand. This is something we understand in basically all other aspects of the economy. We know if you give a desired resource away for free, it will be overused. We know this in water. We know this in electricity use. We know this across the board. If you give something away at very low cost or for basically for free, it will be used. So when you provide more space for cars, you attract people to that space. Maybe they decide that during rush hour, it's a great time to take a discretionary trip. Maybe they decide that now that you've opened up so much more space, maybe some new development should open up further out, whereas that might have been put closer in because of the inconvenience of the travel before. Now we just load up the highway with new development in a way that leaves areas in the core undeveloped, but spreads out development in a way that maximizes congestion with the same number of people. We also have a concept in transportation referred to as the value of time. And this is the concept that there is intrinsic economic value of saving people time. But in transportation, we don't put a floor on it. So if you can produce a model that shows people will save seconds of time, 10, 20 seconds, that can be added up across each user, each driver, and lead to a big number. What we don't look at are the things that might be negative. So for example, while we might be increasing travel speeds along a corridor, we might be cutting off travel across that corridor. And those people who are on Avon or St. Albany, they now have to travel out of their way, and they have a time penalty, but that is not added up and subtracted from the value. It really is just the theoretical time savings on the interstate of not having to be on a surface road anymore. And of course, we are modeling this again without the concept of induced demand. And therefore, we're able to make it look rosier than it is. And also, we're not looking at any of the impacts on people outside of a car, where having to go a few blocks out of the way is going to add significant time and make that area also much harder to serve by transit. And those are often going to be the people in the community who used to be able to take a relatively short trip. Now they have to go way out of their way, whereas the people coming through the community are benefited. I'm going to show a video at this point, and I'm going to just make sure that I'm sharing computer sound. I'm going to cross my fingers and hope you can hear it. If not, add to the chat that you're having trouble hearing it. And again, please put questions in the Q&A.
Interstate system. We're still building incredibly expensive, new or widened highways that divide our communities, produce more congestion and pollution, and make it harder to get around in nearly every way. These costly, disruptive projects often get justified using some fuzzy math known as the value of time, and it's one of the most influential transportation measures you've never heard of. The value of time comes from official federal guidance for quantifying the time savings that new roads and lanes will supposedly produce. And here's how it gets used every day to justify the expense and damage of enormous highway projects. Here's St. Paul, Minnesota in the 1950s. This interconnected grid of streets gave everyone here tons of convenient options for choosing a route to get around. But in the 1960s, Interstate 94 was deliberately routed through the heart of several predominantly black neighborhoods here, taking and bulldozing homes, businesses, and forever changing the community. It also severed at least 8 of the north-south streets that once helped make local trips simple and short. When a state DOT is planning a project, whether a brand new highway like this or just adding a new lane somewhere, this federal guidance on the value of time dictates that they measure the time people inside a vehicle spend on a stretch of road now and then estimate how much time they'll spend on the same stretch of road after building the project. The estimated time saved gets converted to a monetary value to compare to the project's cost. But here's the first major flaw. Agencies typically only measure the speed of the vehicle trips here. The impacts to all other trips are typically ignored. Before I-94, there were scores of north-south streets through that area. But with the neighborhood now cut in half, your once simple trip to the grocery store, school, or doctor's office may have just become 5 minutes longer in order to save someone else a few seconds. The second flaw is that agencies don't even measure the distance of these trips. All they measure is travel time on an arbitrary segment. As long as they predict that vehicles will move slightly faster here, they declare with absolute certainty that the new road will save everyone time. This practice of equating speed with saving time or getting somewhere useful is one reason why we drive further today, because all our destinations are moving further apart. This drive to increase speeds and eliminate congestion at all costs is also how we justify demolishing all the things that made a destination worth visiting in the first place. Lastly, time also gets scaled to income. This means saving wealthier people time is worth more in the calculation, even if it comes at the expense of everyone else. Agencies are also allowed to claim ludicrously small time savings, as if saving anyone 2 to 3 seconds per day produces any actual economic benefits. Slip lanes are a great example of these flaws in practice. Adding these high-speed right turn lanes can be justified because of the fraction of a second they save for drivers. But these dangerous right turn lanes also send cars at high speed directly through marked pedestrian crossings where people walking expect a safe place to cross. In most places, the people walking are more likely to be low income or people of color, but the impacts on them are typically ignored in favor of saving drivers a few seconds. Our time absolutely is valuable, but this limited way transportation agencies are directed to measure time is fatally flawed, ignoring certain trips, people, and their time. It's time for USDOT to repeal this measure and stop states from using it to justify expensive, damaging transportation projects that fail to save any one time. This is adapted from Divided by Design, which explains how low-income communities and people of color have been and continue to be disproportionately harmed by our approach to transportation. It examines the history of the federal transportation program, but the mistakes of the 1960s interstate program are hardly in our past.
I'm going to just jump ahead here because I'm saying all that part already. And I want to point out that these measures are in the rules. So like if you're applying for federal grants, these are the sorts of guidances that you must follow in order to get money. You can quantify theoretical small time savings to drivers, and you don't have to quantify the damage caused to people not driving or crossing the corridor. You also don't actually have to prove that anyone saved time. So think about a big roadway where there's no left-hand turns all the way down the highway. So you have to do a bunch of right-hand turns in order to go in the direction you need to. That could make your trip longer, but because the speed of traffic on that roadway is faster, it's assumed your trip is faster. That might have made sense as a proxy in the 1950s when we didn't know how to measure actual trips, but the GIS knowledge we have today is old and absolutely available for this sort of work if we chose to use it that way, which is, the way we work with folks to measure actual trips, connections for people to jobs and services, no matter how they travel. That is not what we're measuring. Instead, we're measuring a 1950s proxy measure, since at the time they knew this was the right thing to measure, but we didn't have the capacity. The last area I'm going to talk about is forgiving street design. You'll often hear about this when talking to transportation experts, both in planning and design. What they mean by forgiving is when a driver is going at high speed, sometimes they need forgiving space in order to give them a place to regain control if they lose control of their vehicle at high speed, or to avoid a crash that pops up out of nowhere at high speed. But that very same forgiving street design is incredibly unforgiving to those outside of a vehicle. And they allow high speed, well, they allow agencies to believe that they can accommodate high speed travel in a safe way when you absolutely cannot. We know you can't, because in the 1950s, when we were looking at creating high speed connections between communities, we said you can't do that on the old airline highways and surface highways. We need to build something that's divided, because that's safer than having people travel at 50 miles per hour past a multitude of cross streets, parking on the side of the road, entrances to parking lots and businesses and things like that. I'm actually not going to play this because I want to have time for conversation, but also on our website, on the Divided by Design website, you can see this video, which was created by the Wall Street Journal, that shows that the way we create speed limits is in reaction to behavior, not saying, you know, the speed limit we are seeking is, say, 25 miles per hour, and therefore we need to design the road to make going faster uncomfortable. We instead take a backseat, very passive approach, and if people start violating the speed limit, we accommodate the speeding that then creates more deadly conditions. And the people who are most likely to be struck and killed, particularly as pedestrians, are Black and Native Americans. Black Americans are twice as likely to be struck and killed while walking, and Native Americans are 3 times as likely as white Americans to be struck and killed while walking. This is actually data from US EPA's EJ Screen tool that shows the census tract where people of color are disproportionately located, and also where you can find high levels of PM 2.5. And you do see that there's a relationship, because as we put this high-speed road travel through the middle of communities that were likely Black or brown at the time we built it and remain that way, both because that's, you know, where their families grew up, but also because that's not going to be terribly expensive property, because you're polluting the heck out of it and making it hard to get around, that it is therefore Black and brown people that are more likely to be exposed to pollutants that cause very serious health impacts like asthma and other kinds of lung damage, heart problems, and many, many more. So the cycle comes with a heavy cost. It deprioritizes equitable access while elevating danger and exposure to pollution. In many of our reports, we see car-oriented communities just leaving people without access to the things they need. And then when more people are forced to buy cars, it creates more traffic and more pollution and more health outcomes. But that very traffic is then used as an excuse, using all the things we've talked about, to justify causing more damage. All right, so moving on to some more positive things. We look at several areas that could be improved. We start by pointing out that all solutions need to not just involve the community, but be led by the community. We need to move from a public engagement effort, often it's a public lecture where experts come and tell the public why a change is going to be made, and then we accept comments, but it's not really engaging them in creating the solution. We don't go through a lot of discussion in this report about the best ways to work with communities, because frankly, other organizations have done an excellent job on this. But I commend you to look at some of our partner organizations who talk about good ways to involve the public, including folks like PolicyLink. And we focus on, even today, if the community is involved and creates a great model to go forward, they run headfirst into big barriers to realizing that vision because of all these rules that are put in place back in the 50s and continue today. So number one, we should measure what matters most. States should be measuring access to everyday needs. As of today, Virginia DOT does that. And in fact, Virginia DOT did a lot of work to help others to figure out how to do this, to measure full trips from a census block to all the jobs in the region, to grocery stores, to educational facilities and daycare and things like that, and by all modes of travel. And that way, we're really gathering who has the best access to those basic necessities and whether or not it is equitably supplied. And we're not simply using the speed of vehicles as a very sloppy and overly simplified proxy for whether or not folks do have access. As it turns out, while cars may be going faster, often others are being denied full access to those destinations by what we're doing just to make the cars theoretically move a little bit faster. Also, we want to see a quantification of the negative impacts of those investments, not just the positive. If you only tell the positive story and you don't tell the negative story, you're not telling the full story. We need a fuller and more current picture of traffic deaths in the United States. So you saw a little piece of our work called Dangerous by Design, which I invite people to go check out on Smart Growth America's website, which gets into issues of the design of roadways and pedestrian fatalities and why that's more likely to impact Black and brown neighborhoods. But we are missing a ton of information here, including some basic issues like of the fatalities out there, who is using a mobility assisted device? And we need better information about who's being impacted. We should use these measures to design our projects and determine funding priorities. And the transportation agencies, whatever they're measuring, should do a better job in looking at whether or not the benefits that they're measuring are being equally spread across their community with a particular look of performance for vulnerable communities. It's not great to have a good average if it's doing only good things for wealthier communities and it's causing simultaneous harm to poorer communities. We also want to see a repair of the damage that's been done while ending the repeated mistakes. In my experience, since I started in the mid-90s, when we identify a problem in transportation, what we say is, let's create a little program to fix the damage that has been created over decades and decades, but you can use the overwhelming bulk of the program to continue to create those problems. And that's not going to fix anything. So in terms of reconnecting communities, we have a few $1 billion over the next 5 years to spend to reconnect communities damaged by infrastructure, but we can spend hundreds of billions of dollars at the same time creating new fractures in communities, and that's not getting us anywhere. And we just like to see state and local decision makers looking at utilizing all money to create better connected communities. We also need to see a prioritization of the safety of everyone over the speed of a few. We often say a priority of my team is safety over speed. There's a lot of good evidence out there that slower speeds don't actually create a problem with travel times, that often what we do to speed up travel creates more crashes, also creates more need for stoplights and things that actually slow travel overall. Just because you get to a top speed that's faster, the starting and stopping doesn't actually help. And we're doing that at the sacrifice of the communities you're going through. And then we should always consider land use and transportation together. That means really thinking about access to destinations in both areas should be an essential part of both land use or development and transportation decisions. Right now, we see people do this. The land use folks say we're doing a good job, but those transportation people are messing us up. And the land use folks say we're doing a good job, but those transportation people are messing us up. And this is not fixing anything. What we need to do is put in place in everybody's rules that they must consider the opposite. All right, so that gets us to the end of the presentation, and I am very happy to answer any questions. I see a bunch of things in the Q&A. Want to point out that you can see a lot of information on this on Divided by Design, the report is available in a PDF version, but there's also a very interactive website that we think is a better way to interact with the report than just a static PDF. So I'm going to stop sharing at this point. I saw a robust conversation in the webinar chat about why Black and brown folks are more likely to be hit while walking. I really do commend you, since that is really a whole hour-long presentation in and of itself, to go and look at our try that again, our Dangerous by Design report. It also includes some videos and a webinar that can get into detail there. I will say that the two biggest reasons are those folks are less likely to have access to a reliable vehicle for every single person over 16 in their household. Just having one vehicle in a household of 5 is not the same thing as actually helping people drive every place, and that it is more likely to find high-speed roadways through Black and brown neighborhoods, like you saw on the EJ, the EPA's EJ mapping system. That has also a very economic component too, and we do see poor white communities harmed, but in the results, we do see a bigger burden on Black and brown communities. And that does go back to Divided by Design, that shows that we targeted these communities for these highways and these high-speed roadways from the beginning, and that is our legacy today. And when we build upon them and continue them, we are continuing that effort. So I see a whole bunch of questions. I will try to get to all those that I can. And I will also let folks know that we can follow up. We generally follow up with a blog post after these sort of webinars, where we can answer any questions I don't get to. The first question is, was most of this done under eminent domain, and how does one defend the property owner? Yes, a bunch of this, most of this was done under eminent domain. I will say that today there is a better record of compensating people for losing their houses, though that's not really the same thing as leaving communities intact. And I would commend folks to look at a great LA Times article written by a reporter named Liam Dillon that talks a lot about the state of the issue today, and the fact that it continues to be Black and brown communities that are more likely to lose their property, even though they are compensated. There's more than a money compensation when you're tearing apart neighborhoods. There's a question here, as a regional government MPO, how can we get started doing this analysis for our own region? Yes, I'm so glad you asked. There is a lot that we can do here. I would love for folks to see the excellent work that my colleagues at SSTI have done. They have actually put together a guide on how to measure access to jobs and essential services. I think this is something that it would be wonderful to see MPOs take on, as well as cities and states. It's a much more meaningful measure of the success or failure of their transportation system. And SSTI worked with some other experts in the community to create this this guide on how to do this analysis, which Virginia DOT uses today, and gave their knowledge away for free, hoping that people would use it. If you're interested in more information about what's going in Virginia, we'd be happy to connect folks to that work. let's see, we did not look for relatives or folks along the construction of these segments, but I would love for folks to take a look at AARP's work in this area. And they actually did do interviews through many neighborhoods that were harmed by interstate highways about the impact of these highways to them. I also remember seeing a question earlier on whether or not we looked at what would have been damaged by the highways that were planned but not built based on what was built then. And the answer is no. What we were trying to show is what exists today that is creating value for people, businesses, the community, and the government that would not be there today had the highway been built. So when we look at highway segments that were built, we can look at what was taken away. But in terms of the highways that were built, what would never have come to fruition today? Because frankly, we lost more than what was wiped out by those highways. We lost what could have been. And so that's what the story we're trying to tell with regard to the highways that were planned but not built. How much of these plans were influenced by auto industry to minimize public transportation investment? I know the answer to that question. It's a great question. We certainly know of the auto industry messing with transit in certain parts of the country. But I really think that if you read books about this era, the notion was that, the future was autos, and trains and streetcars and things like that were seen as antiquated and in the past. So there's a big cultural component in there. I have a question here that says, it seems like analyses like this, let's see, could impact the fix it first debate. Why do states continue to prioritize expansion over highways? Well, if I could answer that question, that would be wonderful. I agree that it could have an impact. And one of the reasons we point out the damage caused by these efforts is it is important to tell people the full cost of doing this when we're comparing projects. And that's why I think measuring the right things are so important, and changing the federal rules around what can be measured in what way and what can't, and admitting that the way it is done today puts the thumb on the scale for certain outcomes and certain kinds of people, which tend to be people with more options and more money. And I do want to point out that the way that the value of time is calculated is set by the Secretary of Transportation at USDOT. It is not required by law that it stay that way. It was updated at the discretion of USDOT in 2016, and it could be updated again. But I honestly think that it goes beyond the car lobby. I think that the answer to how do we, quote, fix congestion is a difficult one that people don't like. And it's easier to offer people a faux solution than admit to the challenge of congestion. And the answer is, we're not going to fix congestion. If you desire to live far away from the places you need, you're going to need to plan for more travel. And if you live in an area that everything you need is far away from you, then driving is going to be less convenient, full stop. And that's not a great answer for politicians or state DOTs that are often, expert in one thing, which is building segments of highway. But we certainly hope that this would build the case for a fix-it-first approach. We have a statement here, the 68 report, the Freeway and the City Commission by FHWA, recommended design prescriptions for the routing and design of new urban freeways. Are there design principles in that report that remain relevant? I can't get into the specifics of that, but I can say that if you look back particularly at the Eisenhower administration, which a lot of their records have been plumbed and shared, by Jeff Davis at Eno, it shows that putting the highways through the middle of town and causing the damage to urban cores was in no way the desire of the Eisenhower administration. It was more that once it was put out into the field, this program was put out in the field with full discretion given to states. Frankly, the feds lost control and lost the thread. They gave away their ability to manage this, and they still do today. The fact of the matter is we have many members of Congress running around talking about how the latest infrastructure law will reduce emissions, while there's no place in the bill that it requires that. There is a little bitty program called the Carbon Reduction Program, which makes about 2% of the program, while the rest of the program need not reduce carbon. That is not going to result in lower emissions overall, especially if we can, as the current rules allow, justify a project as reducing carbon emissions by adding more lanes. The idea is you add more lanes, congestion goes away, cars move at a better pace, and there's less congestion. In reality, it just attracts more trips, attracts more development that adds more trips, increases vehicle miles traveled, and increases congestion. But in spite of decades of experience in this, this area comes under no introspection or change. So it's frustrating. The next question is a very important question. Do the impact assessments in the NEPA process help prevent perpetuation of some of these patterns? Is the community impact analysis process part of NEPA? Does Title VI help? Could I comment more on the current legal context? I think the evidence is no, it doesn't, because if these things actually helped, we wouldn't still be building these things. You saw the example of what happened in Houston, where USDOT held up a highway an interstate expansion there for potential Title VI problems, and the negotiation to address it was very minor additional investments in more affordable housing in the area. But all the same properties will be taken, all the same damage will be done to the community, all in the name of potentially reducing congestion by increasing speeds, which, you know, Texas is the poster child for induced demand. The more they build, the worse their traffic gets. And yet we're just going to keep doing the same thing, assuming that we will get a different result. The NEPA process is not particularly helpful. NEPA only requires that a project we identify the damage it's going to cause and we mitigate it to the extent we can. It does not require that the damage not be done. So fundamentally, it is not hitting the problem. NEPA doesn't stop bad projects. It just mitigates some of the damage. And in NEPA, you can claim environmental benefits caused by reducing congestion by increasing highway capacity, which we know does the reverse. So until USDOT and EPA start to acknowledge things like induced demand, we are never going to have a chance at something like NEPA stopping projects that cause damage. But so far, neither EPA nor USDOT show an appetite of addressing these things. Unfortunately, we are quickly running out of time, so I will try to hit a couple more, but again, I will do my best to provide some answers to these questions in a future blog post, because there are so many thoughtful and lovely questions here, and I cannot tell you how much I appreciate everyone not just signing up to join us today, but engaging the way you have. I have a question here that says, has there been a traffic study showing how long it takes for a new highway to become congested after it's built? The increase in local trips caused by cutting of connecting streets disconnects businesses and forces them to move to the intersections where it's easier to access. This concentrates additional congestion on the streets where there are overpasses. Okay, so there's about 4 great statements here that I won't be able to parse all, but there have been some great studies that show induced demand and how long it takes to arrive. There's a great calculator of this that we participated in developing called the shift calculator that we worked on with NRDC and the Rocky Mountain Institute. And it measures not just induced demand, but also the increased carbon emissions caused by that induced demand and the increased vehicle miles traveled. And it's based on the excellent work done at UC Davis by Susan Handy and Jamie Volker. And they did this work based on all of the data out there, all of the incredible research demonstrating how added capacity leads to induced demand. And they have continued to improve their work and pull in new data. So originally there was a belief that from the data out there that induced demand is different at the interstate level versus a surface level arterial. And later data has shown that the induced demand is just as strong in both places. So it's a growing area, but there's actually great data out there. It's just not terribly well acknowledged at the public works or DOT level, and it still is not really acknowledged properly at US DOT. You do not need to study it or claim it in your claimed benefits. And they have not even said, just go back and measure whether or not the outcomes you thought would occur did occur, and report to us how accurate your models are so we can decide how much weight to put on them going forward. All right, well, unfortunately it is 2:59 and I see so many amazing questions here. And there's a lot of questions here about additional things I wish we could study. And we will certainly consider studying. As I started the call, I pointed out that we do not have the ability to get into every part of the inequities of the transportation system. The fact that at the federal level and at most state levels, we spend at least $4 on highways for every dollar in transit, which has inequities built into that right there. And in some states, it's against their constitution to spend any highway dollars, any highway user fee dollars, so gas taxes or tire taxes or things like that on transit. I could go on and on, but what I'm hoping this report does is shows folks that even where you have an agency that wants to do the right thing, they run head first into these barriers built into the procedure, the performance measures, the guidances, the design guides, and all those sorts of things that govern their field. And we, as people who may not be experts, or people who are, maybe not attracted to some of the nerdy details of transportation, need to engage in that if we want to see different outcomes. We need to empower these agencies to be able to even try something different. And the only way they can try something different is if the barriers to doing that are removed. So again, I just want to thank everyone for participating, for your just phenomenal questions, for the incredible chat that I promised to go back and read because I just saw so many great points and posts and just links to other great tools out there. And I really appreciate all of the enthusiasm around doing better here. We're going to have to work hard to unwind 70 years of inequities in this program. I mean, they started on a pile of inequities before this program, but I think with the kind of thoughtfulness I've seen in the chat and in the questions and the enthusiasm here, it's something we can all do together. Thanks again, everybody, and I hope you all have a great day. Go out and fight these terrible standards.